Welcome, everyone. It's a real pleasure to welcome you on behalf of E3G, IIED, BMU, and WRI for this kind of concluding session on the recovery that we really need. Our apologies for the technical glitch in the opening, so I'm going to keep my initial remarks incredibly concise so we can hear from many of our colleagues. My name is Manish Papna. I'm the Executive Vice President of the World Resources Institute. The exam question for this session is how do we advance a more inclusive, a more resilient, a more green recovery from the pandemic and the economic crisis? How do we do so in ways that enable us to align and achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement? We've had a number of sessions over the course of the week that really shine a light on this issue. The purpose of this concluding session is really to wrap all of this together, to distill some of the key lessons, and to chart a path forward. Particularly relevant to have this session today, as many of you may know, today's World's Children's Day. In no small part because the Declaration of the Rights of the Child, the Convention on the Rights of the Child were signed on this day in 1959 and 1989, respectively, as we think about the recovery, as we think about the economic crisis, as we think about the climate crisis, thinking about the next generation is incredibly important. We have a great set of panelists. The way this will be structured is I'm going to introduce it to one of my colleagues at E3G, who's going to give some initial remarks, go through an interactive exercise. Then we have a panel with three other colleagues, one from government, one from the think tank, one kind of working in an NGO, kind of more on the front lines. And then someone from E3G is going to help provide some concluding remarks. I'm going to introduce each of them now. Let me start though with Seema Korea, who is the Senior Policy Advisor leading E3G's Better Recovery Unit. I'm going to keep the introductions very short because of time. Hope you all understand. But Seema, why don't I turn it over to you for the interactive exercise and for some quick remarks, and then we'll turn to the panel in just a moment. Seema.
Sounds good. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Seema. I'm here in Berlin, and I'm delighted to be joining you all. So why don't we kick off our closing session with a quick poll. I'm going to start it now, and you have two questions. I'm going to allow the panelists to vote as well. So there we go. We've just started the poll. Two questions for you about how green the recoveries are, the undergoing recoveries around the world, and how optimistic you are that we can turn this around in 2021. And I think we're going to ask one of these questions again at the end. And I can see that a bunch of results are already coming in. Let's see. Okay, let's give it another few seconds and then I'll end the polling and see where everyone lands. People are rather pessimistic, I think. Okay, so why don't we stop the polling here? So 70% of you roughly think that on a scale of 1 to 10, the recoveries being planned around the world are not green at all, so 0 to 4. But then in very large parts, 97% of you are somewhat optimistic. So good signs for 2021, but more effort is required. So we'll do that again at the end of the exercise, at the end of our session. And to kickstart the discussion, I wanted to reflect on three questions with you very briefly. The first is, how different is this crisis that we're seeing? The second question is, are we on track for a green recovery? And the third question is, what do we need to do differently? And really the purpose is just to set the stage and then get the conversation going. So first of all, how different is this crisis that we're looking at? I think we've had a number of discussions over the past months as to how unique this crisis is. We don't need to go into detail about the rarity of pandemics, the sheer scale of this crisis, even the economics of it. But we've had many crises before, and to be sure, the Great Lockdown does share a number of characteristics with the great financial crisis, and has restarted some conversations that we have already seen in the past, so in post-2008, basically. Back then, we were already discussing the fact that we had seen an unknown type of risk materialize. We were also talking about the need to get policymakers around the world to prepare, at the very least, for risks that they were aware of, namely climate change, and to stop fighting the last war. And as you may recall, there was already talk back then about green recoveries in the post-2008 world. The question is, this time, are we on track for this green recovery? And the short answer is, well, there's some improvement, but we're certainly not there yet. The policy conversation, to be sure, about green recovery is louder than last time. This conversation was very active this week at LCAW. We also heard back this week from stakeholders who really are trying to take the bull by the horns. So Global South champions such as the Philippines or Kenya explained, I think this was yesterday or a couple of days ago at an event organized by WRI actually, how they were trying to take a much more holistic approach to the crisis and the recovery and put climate at the heart of it. But we're nowhere where we need to be. First, in terms of sheer scale of the response, we're talking about $12 to $15 trillion of fiscal stimulus, compared to $18, $20 billion in terms of that support going to clean energy and clean policies. And in addition, and more importantly, perhaps, what we're hearing and seeing in the world right now are, and we saw this week at LCAW, are conversations that are still too narrow and that take that function within old silos and old structures, where we really need to be taking a much more broad approach to this crisis. And so in thinking about what we need to do differently, this is what I would end with, and what I would put out there for our attendees and panelists to also reflect on, and they will have a lot to say about this. But I think that what we need is a quantum leap and thinking outside of existing silos, focusing on creating a whole system solution. And in particular, thinking of designing a decisive shift of the whole financial system. The financial system is, by and large, the nervous system of our economies, of our societies, and we need to develop an overarching reform program that will align public and private finance and redirect them towards climate change. I wanted to give a special shout out here to our friends from WWF UK, who were talking about redirecting private and public financial flows to nature-based solutions in particular. And second, the second thought I wanted to share with you before closing my remarks was that a whole system solution also hinges on forging a new, deeper kind of solidarity between the global north and the global south in particular. And this goes beyond traditional development agendas of the past. Thank you very much. And I'll leave it there, and then I'll come back at the end with the poll once again.
Great. Thank you so much, Seema. And you know, the point, the current recovery programs are far from green. I think the data shows that, the poll shows that, and kind of your analysis of kind of where we are today compared to the global financial crisis further reinforces that we are far from even where we were 10, 12 years ago. Yet I was also struck, if I heard the numbers correctly, that the vast majority of people on this call feel somewhat or quite optimistic that we can turn it around moving forward. And that's what we're, so how do we do that, right? And that's what we're going to explore during this session, and in this, particularly in this next part. Let me ask the panelists, and I'm going to introduce them right now, to also turn on their videos. We have Claire Shakia, who is the director of IIED's Climate Change Research Group, spent previously 15 years at DFID. She'll be joining us. Musanda Kapena, who is the director and registered trustee of Namfumu Conservation Trust, over 20 years of experience with forest communities promoting indigenous knowledge systems in Africa. Is she with us? If not the video, let me know if she's here on the audio. I know there's been some.
She will be joining in just a moment.
Okay.
Manoj.
No problem. So, and then we have Norbert Gorissen, who is the Deputy Director General for the German Federal Ministry of Environment, Nature Conservation, and Nuclear Safety. Norbert, please feel free to join us with your video as well. Claire, I'm going to start with you.
I'm here,
so, you know that basically.
I'm here. I don't know what I can do in order to get my video on. So perhaps somebody can help me.
Okay, we'll try to help you. And Claire, while we are doing that, let me turn to you. Kind of, how do you see the story? What's working? What's not? Where are the challenges, and what do we need to do to overcome?
So this week we heard a lot about how to place climate, nature and development at the heart of a green recovery. The pandemic really brings home the interconnectedness of issues. Poor are multitasking with myriad risks in the south, and it also shows the interconnectedness of our world. And the main message this week for me is that the solidarity agenda that Seema mentions requires significant reform of the response architecture, bringing together development, climate, nature, and humanitarian responses to build a regenerative society that can adapt and thrive. And there were three parts to this. First, we face multiple crises: climate change, biodiversity, rising inequality, and now COVID-19. And we must recognize the impact of these challenges are unequal. And the pandemic is further entrenching those inequalities and undermining progress towards tackling these crises. So there's a huge global effort on recovery, as we've been talking about all week. And whilst we still struggle to contain the pandemic, we need to recognise and we need to reconsider the nature of these stimulus packages. Without this, the recovery is set to deepen inequalities and prop up extractive economies. Too few consider resilience at all. So the effort, I guess, that we could all be working on now is to redesign the green recovery responses to be equitable and to engage the whole of society. We heard this week about solutions that do collectively address climate, nature and development that could be at the heart of this recovery. And financing could also include large-scale debt for climate and nature swaps, basically performance-based payments behind more strategic responses. And as we've seen in the pandemic, engaging communities in the response is mission critical. We must invest in locally led responses that draw in that deep intergenerational knowledge of local communities, Indigenous peoples, to tackle the underlying drivers of vulnerability. So the second part of this is driving locally led action means delivering business unusual finance, whether that's climate or development or private investment. So we need to re-energize the aid effectiveness principles that we have agreed within the development sector with what we have learned about coherent responses to climate, nature and poverty. And this week we had broad support for the 8 principles for locally led adaptation being proposed by IIED and WRI and a whole range of other actors. And these would work to guide this green recovery, which gives agencies to local actors. And there's growing momentum for governments north and south, as well as wider actors to sign up to these. We've already seen the LDC Initiative for Effective Adaptation and Resilience highlight what this means in practice, as does the World Bank's support to the Kenya County Climate Change Funds and the ADB's, the Asian Development Bank's Community Resilience Partnership Programme. So we're beginning to see how these can actually be delivered. During this week, we had the chair of the least developed countries and a range of southern grassroots organisations welcoming the recognition by funders and the brokers that intermediate the finance, that business as usual is not good enough, but they call for more. They ask the development partners to work themselves out of a job, strengthen southern delivery capabilities and put business unusual into practice, not just pay it lip service. So effective responses must be tailored to local needs, and this requires devolving agency and resources. The LDCs, for example, are committing 70% of climate finance to be invested by local actors. Partnerships that are vertically and horizontally connected are critical to pool resources, break down silos, build trust, and maximise the impact of every penny. And the third part of this re-engineering of the response is learning from the experience of building capacity for delivering effective responses, which shows that it must be long-term with patient support to build leadership. The reflections from the least developed countries and a range of other actors noted a clear distinction between the business as usual understanding of capacity building, which is top-down, rigid deliverables and short timeframes, compared to business unusual, which they were calling for strengthening capabilities through building networks, peer-to-peer and mutual learning, being more demand-driven, more non-linear, and focusing it around individuals and society norms. And my final point is that engaging citizens, whether businesses or the arts, as well as governments, it's really critical for building this whole of society response, but requires an investment in the leadership skills of those with least voice, or they just participate in name only. Thanks, Manish.
Great. No, thank you. And just, you know, this point about how we reform the response architecture to be much more, to put people at its heart, to be much more about equity, the whole of society approach, the kind of second point around kind of locally led action, and the importance then of building capacity to enable both the effective response, but the leadership capacities of those agencies, how to equip them to have the agency. So just an incredibly important set of points about what we need to do differently in order to get this recovery, to actually meet and respond to the needs that people have, that the SDGs have, that the Paris Agreement calls for. Norbert, great to see you. You and we kind of co-hosted a really important set of dialogues on exactly this topic over the past 3 or 4 months. It'd be great to hear your insights on this question. Over to you, Norbert.
Thank you very much, Manish, and also thank you for ECG for organizing that. And it's really good to reflect where we are. We started the joint dialogues, WRI and BMU, in April, actually, and I think we had our concluding session in early July. And I think we had a little bit of different expectation where we are right now to where we are today. So therefore, it's very good to reflect, and thanks for organizing this session. I would like to challenge a little bit the points made by Seema. I don't think this is a crisis as every crisis. I think it's quite different. In particular, I would like to mention at the very beginning the relationship of this crisis with the way how we use nature, how we use land, and how we encroach biodiversity. We have learned that this pandemic is very much coming from our way how we misuse nature. But also, it was remarkable when we had these dialogues in the beginning, Manish, we developed the notion of people discovered a postcard from the future in the first lockdown, when they realized that the air was clean, cities were not that noisy, and the waters were clear, less traffic. So in a way, and we always felt a little bit strange whether this is cynical or not, but we could also see some very interesting positive development, and people experienced very well that this is a very fundamental crisis which goes to the heart of themselves, and that there is a real need for change. And then a lot of rhetoric, and I think, Manish, in our dialogues we contributed to that, was developed about green recovery and better building back better, etc. But the reality, and that has been said, so far hasn't been that good. I would like to comment here in particular the work of Vivek Economics, who have developed this greenness of stimulus index, and everybody's reporting to that, and you can see, okay, the European Union has done quite well, Germany and France and Spain, the UK, some other countries tried hard, like Korea, but the balance between good and bad is not yet clear. But most of the recovery programs are more on the bad side, and that was reconfirmed by the poll which Seema had introduced in the beginning. And I think that is true, because that is the case because, first of all, we were very humble in the beginning to be louder in our request. We said first things first, and that is rescue and relief. And what happened in this rescue and the relief, that incumbent structures I think made the case, in particular social and the social dimension and rescue of jobs was very dominant. And I think a lot of very conventional structures have been supported and got stimulus. Politicians were not there and really to work towards a courageous system change. My second point would be, look where we are today. So we were expecting that perhaps in the second half of this year or by the end of the year, we would be over the pandemic. But what we are experiencing right now is the second wave and serious lockdowns, and it may become even worse over the coming weeks. So I just can report in Germany, the number of infections today has been the highest ever. And although we have already quite a light lockdown, so that's not a good signal. And although we have the positive signals about vaccines coming up, this will still take time, and the next weeks and months will be hard. And some economies and a lot of people will be hit very hard. And then the question, I think, for all of us is now, what does that mean for a new wave of recovery programs? And how can we learn from what we have done in the past, and how can we do better? And one in particular issue is becoming stronger on the agenda, which is the debt crisis. So increasing debt in particular for developing countries, shrinking fiscal spaces for doing the urgent things which needed to be done. The G20 has started to work with on this. Debt service suspension initiative has started, but it's still not the systemic change, and it's just buying us time. And I think that is the opportunity now, while this is further developed over the time, to really look how we can link this debt crisis. And it's not just a debt crisis for developing countries, I must say. Looking at some European countries, they are also strongly hit with regarding their expenses. So look at the opportunities, to what extent we can include sustainability, greening issues, biodiversity, climate change in the next round of recovery programs, and in perhaps all the discussions about what we do to overcome the debt crisis. And a lot of initiatives are ongoing. Some of them have been presented here in this week, and I think I like to highlight that as well. My third point would be the private sector. There's a really mixed picture. On the one hand, some companies and sectors were really asking for bailouts of, I would say, business models of the past. Look in particular at the aviation industry, and I can also make here the case of the German airline Lufthansa. It's not really clear whether, when and how they will come on a level which brings them back to real sustainable business. And this would certainly be different from the business model they had in 2019. That's true for a number of other sectors. On the other hand, I think a lot of business are increasingly understanding, even during that crisis, that things have to be changed, that climate change is still a major risk for them, that stranded assets are becoming a reality. Nobody who is serious is investing any longer in coal, and that's also true for the heavy industries. They start seriously discussing about how to decarbonize the steel sector, the cement sector. Saying very good signals, and also I think people understand that the way how we work will change. So most of us are working from home at the moment. I'm sure it's not sustainable to stay in this mode forever, but it's also clear that we will not go back to where we have been. There will be more video conferences, more working from home than in the past, and there will be less traveling, less business traveling. So there's a lot of opportunities in that. And my final point on the private sector is also looking at the food industry, where there are also signals that they understand that the way how they're producing food is not sustainable, and that their supply chains may be to reconsider. My fourth and last point would be then opportunities. So many of us had been expecting 2020 to be the super year. in a way, it was a super year, but not as we were thinking about it. So maybe we should think about the super year 2021 now. There's some opportunities for that. First of all, the elections in the US, bringing us a president which very likely will take a different take and will be in the front line when it comes to fighting climate change, and possibly also on the other solid issues which I mentioned, like biodiversity and debt crisis. There's an emerging consensus, surprisingly, about net zero coming up with the recent announcement of China to go for net zero by before 2060, and taking Japan and Korea, the European Union with its Green Deal, which is very seriously implemented now. It's not that much reported about it, but we take it serious, and we hope we will have a European climate law, legally binding climate law in place by the end of the year, which would enshrine the net zero target, but also an ambitious targets for 2030. And even the International Energy Agency has come up with a scenario which is now in line with a 1.5 degree scenario. So there's good signals around that. I think more is needed to think about resilience, adaptation, and biodiversity protection. The COP15 in Kunming in China offers an opportunity here, the upcoming adaptation summit, but I think that's an area where the momentum is not yet there. The G7 next year, I think, could play a crucial role here. UK is heading that. Perhaps the 7 leaders are almost united on those issues and can really come up with very comprehensive messages on global solidarity, on reforming the institutional setup, and bringing us really better out of this crisis. I stop here, and thanks a lot.
Thank you, Norbert. Really useful kind of story about kind of where we were, where we are, and where we could be. And that was very, very useful to kind of share kind of that storyline with us. And the question, of course, is how do we get from where we are to where we should be? What do we need to do differently in order to help make sure that those opportunities are indeed fully leveraged? I want to check to see if Musanda Kapina was able to join us. We as many of you know, we had a small technical issue, but I think, is she?
She should now be on your list.
Oh, wonderful.
Ah, there she is.
Yes.
I'm around.
Musanda, delighted. I hope you've been able to hear the conversation so far. So I won't repeat the question, but just in the interest of time, turn it over to you. Great to have you here.
I'd appreciate it if you repeated the question.
Sure.
I don't have,
sure.
Yeah. I don't have
I
power. We have a power outage here, but then I've been able to manage with technology. Yeah.
So no, absolutely. And for those, just to repeat, I did introduce you earlier as the Director, Registered Trustee at Namfumu Conservation Trust. Told a little bit about your background. Seema, Claire, and Norbert have been speaking a lot about the recovery, the response to the pandemic and the economic crisis, kind of where we, what has happened so far, not very great, where we need to go, and how we get there. So just how important the next 12 months are and what can be done, what can we do, what needs to be done to help ensure that the recovery moving forward is indeed inclusive, it's resilient, it's sustainable. And so it'd be great to hear your thoughts on kind of from where you sit, where are we, and what needs to change? What do we need to do differently?
Okay, so thank you very much. I'm from Zambia and I'm representing the community level. So I'll speak from a community level perspective. Specifically to Zambia, the COVID has affected everybody in the urban area and the rural area, forest communities badly as well. Though for Zambia, the main cases have been coming out of the urban areas, mainly because it's very cosmopolitan and it's high density. Whereas in the rural areas, the settlement patterns are scattered, so they do not have a lot of contact with each other. as compared to the urban area. So some of the challenges we have faced is that there's been a reduction of income at household level, especially in urban areas. People were asked to go home, some of them on pay and some of them not on pay. Whereas in the community, a lot of our rural folk depend on forest products and agriculture. So the main effect is that there's an issue on cash flow. Most people do not have the money to disposable income. So our approach has been to work with the older people in the rural communities, in the sense that they have a lot of indigenous knowledge systems that have assisted them to be resilient against COVID. We haven't reported a single case in the rural areas, which is astonishing. So that informed our exploration of why is that happening. So we found that the main issue was that the rural areas eat a lot of natural foods, forest-based foods, which are unrefined. And they have a lot of indigenous knowledge systems which ensure that they protect themselves from disease by steaming themselves in herbal infusions, by eating certain wild fruits and vegetables, which makes their immunity very resilient. So part of the recovery process in the urban area is that we need to take the herbal infusions and the natural foods to be more accessible to the urban population, which is the more productive population in the country. When they start consuming a lot more of the forest commodities, of the mushrooms and the edible insects, we eat termites in Zambia, we eat caterpillars, and that is all just natural omega fats. So it would be nice, and we've been working with FAO to add value to forest commodities, so that I can tell you that my grandmother and her peers would just walk into the bush and come back with a basket of leaves and herbs. But in the urban areas, we don't have the forest resource or the knowledge to do that. So it would be nice to add value and create like sachets or usable dosages of the steaming, of the teas, of the foods, which can then be marketed in the urban areas. This would also create an income base for the forest communities, where right now we have a challenge of marketing. A lot of the urban traders are feeling scared to go into the rural areas and vice versa, because they don't want a cross-contamination of COVID and its related infections. So going forward, the recovery is based on adding value to indigenous knowledge systems, which have worked for ages in the villages, derived from the forest resources, and package it and market it in the urban areas. It's working already, but the challenge is that the handling and the standards and the food safety issues are not really there. So working backwards, we need to go back into the forest communities and train them on how to handle what sanitation aspects to take care of. How do we package the herbs to maintain their efficacy? How do we demonstrate how to prepare a herbal porridge, knowing that our urban population would not want to have porridge, they would want to have as international support, is firstly the recognition that the remedies are there in the forest communities. Nature-based solutions are there and the traditional techniques are there, but how do we marry the scientific aspects of knowing what the key ingredient is in the herbal steaming, in the teas, in the porridges, in the foods, which can then be extracted and packaged in such a way that it's accessible for the urban areas and internationally as well. Zambia still has a lot of forest as compared to Zimbabwe and Namibia and Botswana and our surrounding countries. So we have had an influx of traders coming in to buy the raw form of the herbs and foods. But then it would add value if we were able to package them and brand them and export them through conventional means. That way we will have food security and cash flow security at the forest level, and then that translates into a conservation of biodiversity, and in the long run, mitigation of climate change with properly defined supply chains and value chains into the urban areas and beyond. I've tried to keep my 10 minutes. I hope it's working, but I'm in the dark right now.
Mutsanda, that was great, yeah. And I really appreciate you, sharing these thoughts while and sharing that picture of how really kind of this picture of ultimately what this is all about when we're talking about a recovery, when we're talking about it being more inclusive, it being more sustainable, it being more resilient, sharing a picture of what that actually looks like. On the ground, and just the need to think about how one marries kind of indigenous knowledge systems with some of the kind of scientific kind of approaches. How does one think about protecting the forests using kind of traditional practices while still finding markets to export in cities or in other countries? How do we find a balance between those and get that balance right? Just incredibly important. I'm going to encourage people to share if they have some questions, some comments, and insights on this this fundamental question about the recovery in the chat box, and then I'll turn to all of you, including Seema, if you'd like to kind of respond to some of these questions. We'll do this for about 10 minutes or so, and then Nick, maybe, who I'll introduce in just a moment, will come on and share a few concluding reflections. So encourage people to share some questions. Alden did have a question here that I will try. Well, I think you all can read it, but it has to do with President-elect Biden, what the US may do kind of on the global stage, particularly with a very likely a leaders summit in the first 100 days, and how that might be able to help inject more momentum into helping create the recovery that we really need. And I wonder, those of you can look at his comments in more detail in the chat box, but it'd be great to see if you have any thoughts on that. He in particular was talking, I think, about the role of the G7 and the G20 in that context. And then Felix has raised a question. What's the green recovery measure that receives the least attention politically? Sorry, there's a lot of questions coming in. So despite its importance in your view, underrated. So what's the green recovery measure that receives the least attention politically despite its importance? Food is going to be vital for all. How is this going to be measured if we need certain types of food from abroad? So how are we going to deal with the food challenge? Genuine, meaningful, locally led action through recovery measures. I think that really speaks to, Clara, some of the points that you were raising. Commenting on the potential roles of the UN and WHO in what seems like a profound crisis of biodiversity as well as climate. What are the lessons that we can learn? Norbert, that might be one for you. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to ask you each maybe just 1 minute, pick one of the questions that kind of you would like to reflect on or offer some thoughts on, and then I'm going to say a couple of words before handing it over to Nick. Who would like to start? Clara, could I call on you?
Yeah, sure. So I think this question of whether there would be value in Biden and the UK and Italy working together around the G7, around the G20, and around the build up to the COP26 is a good one. I mean, obviously, in some ways, does it need an additional meeting? I don't know, but I think what's really important is we sharpen the focus. So we have a look at the Good Climate Finance Guide that we released this week. There's real signs that some of the global funds are learning what works, but we need a much sharper focus on what the practice looks like. The green recovery, the area that's really not thought through, I would say, at all, is resilience. And actually, that is what communities need. They need to be resilient to a range of shocks altogether. And Musonda was talking about the sort of, that actually there are a lot of solutions locally and they just need to be supported. So how do we do that? Reach people in the right ways, incentivize coherent responses. That could be budget transfers to local government. It could be social protection, whether employment guarantees or cash transfers that stop the poorest having to reduce the amount they're eating or sell their productive assets. And when we're thinking about job protection, it needs to be alongside a stimulus that grows the enterprises that offer those green and resilient areas of work. So I guess, yeah, I'd invite the G7, G20 to think about committing behind these good climate finance principles for locally led action and start a journey from the Dutch Climate Adaptation Summit in January to building more effective responses, all central to a meaningful, equitable green recovery.
Thank you, Claire. And just a small note on that point about a resilient recovery. WRI is actually working on a study right now of analyzing resilience in recovery plans. So we've sampled about 75 countries' stimulus programs to see how resilience is actually being embedded in those stimulus programs. We're going to be releasing the results at the Dutch Adaptation Summit in January. Seema, I wonder if I can call on you to see if you want to pick up on a couple of these questions. Everyone, sorry to ask, but 1 minute each, just so we can.
Sure. So I had actually picked the same question as Claire. I will give not a different answer, but a complementary answer. I think I entirely agree with what was just said. I would say that what I'm going to be looking at very closely, and this was raised actually by one of our attendees in the chat section, what I'll be looking at very closely in the first 100 days beyond the kind of international action convening and, the re-energizing of our multilateral fora is the kind of nominations that Joe Biden puts on the table. It's going to be crucial that he appoints people who are ready to take, once again, the quantum leaps that this crisis requires. And I would be very curious to see how he works with the right personnel, especially at the Treasury. I think, we're talking more and more about how the coalition of finance ministers is really going to be very much at the heart of this response. I think that nomination is going to be absolutely crucial. Someone mentioned Janet Yellen. There might be others in that short list, but this is what I would pay very, very close attention to. I think who he names as Treasury Secretary is going to be absolutely essential to that re-energizing capacity.
Thank you, Seema. Musonda, while we have you, because I don't know how long your phone, we'd love to bring you in, please.
Yeah, I just want to mention that the aspect of resilience is married very closely to sustainability. And for Zambia, we've learned that sustainability starts with respecting the indigenous knowledge systems, because in such a case, we don't have anything to teach them. We are learning from them and we are asking them to turn up the volume on what they already know. That way it will be sustainable, because we would have cut out the red tape of going in to talk about concepts that the communities do not know, but we will be in essence encouraging them to produce more dry vegetables, more mushrooms, more herbal remedies and all that. So the aspect of sustainability is that we'll be working with the hearts and minds of the people. They will feel so much more appreciated to be supported in an area that they have always been doing in perpetuity, for us to have found the forest resources that we are enjoying now. So the question of sustainability is that how do we use that knowledge to make sure that we leave a certain amount of biodiversity and wealth for the generations to come? That to me is the surest way of ensuring that whatever green recovery mechanisms we put in place are maintained on a sustainable basis. We will be appreciating what the communities know. We'll just be improving it so that it's palatable to the European market, the American market, the Australian market, and all that. So I think it's a point we really need to note down. That's the key to sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you, Musonda. Norbert.
Thank you. I would also like to highlight resilience, because resilience was one of the items which we discovered already in the first half of the year as central as a reaction to this crisis, and resilience in a really broad and comprehensive sense. Resilience also to our health systems, resilience to our social security systems, of course, resilience also with respect to climate and biodiversity. I think just to highlight that, and it needs more attention. I think that is certainly clear. We have momentum on mitigation. I said that at the moment, but we do not have the same kind of momentum on resilience and adaptation. Secondly, yeah, I'm also not sure whether a leader summit is needed or not. I can understand that the new president would like to appear and would like to convene his new allies. So of course, that's fully realized, but I think it needs a clear agenda, and perhaps this building back better green economy, green recovery, also green economy, and then the global solidarity which is needed, more climate finance, working with countries who are indebted and how to overcome that could be an element of this dialogue. And then the question on what the UN could do on the pandemics and biodiversity loss. Just to highlight, it's many people know, but still it's not in everybody's mind. There will be a COP on biodiversity led by China, hosted by China next year, sometimes in October most likely. And it will have on the agenda the agreement, hopefully agreement of a new framework, multilateral framework post-2020 for protecting biodiversity. And I think the crisis of biodiversity is at least as big as climate, and the pandemic underlines it even further. And I think it needs attention. There's huge potential to bring the agendas of climate and biodiversity together, in particular with this notion of nature-based solutions. And so the UN have the possibility to highlight that in both cases. The Secretary General already does, both in the climate COP and in the biodiversity COP, and help to encourage to meaningful and ambitious and binding commitments and action to protect biodiversity. And the WHO certainly can play a role there, because there is this close link between the pandemics and biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you, Norbert, very much. I just want to say two sentences, and then I'm going to turn it over. As we think a little bit about what we need to do differently moving forward, hearing what all of you have said, kind of thinking about this question over the past 9 months, 4 things, just really getting the narrative right. We haven't yet found a way to really show people at the center of the recovery, thinking about jobs, thinking about multipliers, thinking about ease of implementation of programs that reach those that have lost their jobs, lost their livelihoods. Silos, how we break the silos between climate, environment on one hand, planning and finance on the other, how we leverage the NDCs, how we bring different movements together, this intersectionality kind of comment. And fourth, the financing. The financing at the moment is still going for business as usual financing. It's true in the public side and the private side. So just a few reflections on that. But Nick, we're delighted you've joined us, really to kind of tie a bow on this entire week and kind of how we think about this moving forward. For those who may not know, Nick maybe is the chief executive of E3G, founding director since 2006. Nick, over to you.
Hi there, thanks everyone. I'm also the chair of the London Climate Action Week steering group, so I oversee all of what's happened. And I think it's been amazing, the amount of work on recovery. We started off discussing recovery at LCAW Digital in July with over 70 events. I think, like Norbert, we were full of hope. And I think we're a bit disillusioned now. The economics have been worse than we thought, but also the action's been worse than we thought. And I think one of the key lessons from this London Climate Action Week is not just the kind of conclusions on this call about what more we have to do, but also across all the other themes, the other 200 events, is how people saw the green recovery as the kind of critical path to COP26 and climate action next year. So I think we've got a pretty clear diagnosis. But the question is, what do we do with that? And I think one of the things we want to do going forward to London Climate Action Week next year, and using the whole London networks in particular as a place full of finance and policy, is really to bear down on some of the areas you range. So firstly, trying to work together to pull those solutions out in resilience, in nature, in inclusive work, to really move forward on those financial reforms, to engage with the UK on its G7 agenda and the Italians on the G20, but also through broader networks like the finance ministers, to build action at all levels, including in London, but to show, I think it's time for recovery to be everybody's business. And finally, to reform some of the finance institutions, particularly the development banks, which loads of us are, through our citizenship, shareholders in, to do the financial reform Claire and others have talked about, to get to money to the projects it needs to go to. So this is going to be a huge theme of our work going forward and of London Climate Action Week in 2021. And we hope to see all of you again, hopefully with a more optimistic message of action next time, that we've shown that we can actually take our theories or our solutions and get them into the policy and the financial change we need to happen. So thanks very much. But I think this has just shown how much more work we will need to do.
So Nick, Manish, thank you both very much for that. Thank you to all the participants and to everybody who came and joined this. The whole series of recovery work during London Climate Action Week has been fantastic. It is great seeing all of you, having such a great panel, having such a great share, and just a great team behind all of this. So thank you, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you again, as they say.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Particularly, thank you for overcoming the technical difficulties. That is so much appreciated.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. It's been fun.
Oh, Ms. Sanda, you've been great. Thank you.
Thank you.